family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
It's a full show today, and we certainly do welcome your phone calls. If you weren't able to get through yesterday, we certainly encourage you to give us a call today. 1-800-351-1212. Let me start out for just a few minutes to talk about what might happen to your taxes, what might happen to your health care. And I'm going to do that briefly, because then a lot of people still want to talk about what has been happening to Judge Roy Moore. A sixth accuser says that Roy Moore groped her when she was 28. And speaking of groping, we now have Senator Al Franken in trouble for groping as well. By the way, this is just one of many shoes to drop. As we pointed out yesterday, the attempt to actually have mandatory sexual harassment teaching and screening in Capitol Hill surfaced in large part because of some of these revelations, because of some of the testimony that took place the other day at the House Administration Committee, and also because of a survey that found that at best, at least 1 out of 6 women who responded to this particular survey of congressional staff said they'd been a victim of sexual harassment. So Al Franken will not be the last. As a matter of fact, he may be the first in a very long line. But then, of course, people have a question, well, what can we do? We don't know all the facts, but we know enough and have enough allegations now with Judge Roy Moore that people are saying, well, is there something else we can do? And, of course, one thing that's been proposed by Senator Mitch McConnell is, well, have the current appointed Senator Luther Strange step down and then force the governor to appoint somebody else. I'll come back to this a little bit later this hour, because Alabama Governor Kay Ivey basically threw cold water on that idea and said the election date is set for December 12th. Even if he were to resign, I would simply appoint someone to fill the remaining time until we have election on December 12th. So she wants to get past it. But at the same time, given that some surveys have Roy Moore in a lead over Doug Jones, but others have him way behind Doug Jones, it's quite possible that the Democratic opponent, Doug Jones, might be the next senator from Alabama. So those issues are certainly on the table, and we'll spend some time talking about that. It so happens, because of the way this is scheduled, that we have John Eidsmoe with us in the second hour. We'll be talking about his book, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. But you also have to know that he has served as a lawyer in the Alabama Supreme Court. He and Judge Roy Moore know each other very well. So I do want to get some of his comments, and no doubt you'll want to hear some of his comments about what he knows or doesn't know about Judge Moore and what he thinks about this election taking place in Alabama. So we have a lot to cover here. Let me, before we get into all of these various allegations involving not only Judge Roy Moore, but now Senator Al Franken, which is the latest one, let's just briefly talk about a couple of other issues that will affect you and your family. And one of those is that if you look at the Senate bill right now for the issue of tax reform, they are asking and are going to mandate, or actually require, that the mandate be removed. I don't know how the best way to say it is to repeal the mandate, I guess would be that. They're not going to repeal Obamacare, but they are repealing the mandate. And I would love to hear from some of you, because I've heard in the past, as we've talked about this issue of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, many of you say, I'm offended that I'm forced to actually pay for insurance I don't want, that I will never use. And so there is an attempt to actually repeal just the mandate part of Obamacare, because, first of all, that would allow for there to be a reduction in what could be the cost. Now, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that more than $300 billion will be saved. The reason to be saved is the money that would have been used by the federal government to pay out in health insurance subsidies would not be paid out. So that is the case. As they say in the Wall Street Journal in one of the articles, as a matter of fact, the lead article I've posted today on our website, they said Republicans are right to want to repeal the mandate that fines Americans who don't buy health insurance. Their dual motive is to repeal the most loathed part of the Affordable Care Act, as well as to make tax reform comply with the Senate Byrd rule that dictates no deficits outside of a 10-year budget window. They go on a little bit later, saying some Americans no doubt would decide not to buy insurance if they aren't hit with a tax, but that would be their choice. And what they're saying is you're hearing some making the statements that we're going to kick 13 million people off of insurance. No, some people don't want to be on that insurance policy anyway. They may want to get something else, an alternative, but that is the case. But certainly they might drop out. Many of them might not. But again, the biggest issue that they talk about in this piece that we've posted, I'm only just reading a little bit because I want to get on to some other issues, is that right now the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, is really hurting people that are kind of in the middle. They're talking about those individuals who are forced to buy a product they often cannot afford, but they're not eligible for tax credits or cost-sharing payments to mitigate the damage. But if they don't buy the insurance, their fine can be as large as $1,390. The people that are caught in the middle, they're too poor to actually be able to pay for it themselves, but they're not wealthy enough to deal with some of it, and they're also not too poor to actually be able to qualify for some of those various insurance subsidies. So again, this is one of the issues that is kind of front and center right now in the Senate tax bill. And if you'd like to read a little bit more, I've posted it on the website, pointofview.net. The National Review puts it this way: repealing the mandate will save the government money that it would have otherwise paid out in a form of health insurance subsidies. This would reduce the amount by which the tax reform will widen the deficit, but it almost certainly won't save the more than $300 billion that the Congressional Budget Office estimates. But they also go on to point out that the tax bill now expands the child tax credit to a proposed $2,000. And they say previous iterations of House and Senate bills have merely restructured existing pro-parent features of the tax code, but this change certainly or actually expands them, and that will provide most middle-class families with significant tax relief, and it assuages one of the chief concerns, their concerns, with the initial version of the bill. So many people are saying that the Senate bill is better than the House. And there is a piece, when I come back from the break, I'll read very quickly and then start taking some phone calls. And that is 6 ways the Senate tax reform bill improves the House tax reform bill. And there are a number of reasons to believe that what is actually being debated in the Senate right now might be better for your family. I know a lot of you are going to want to talk about Judge Roy Moore, and I've already seen some calls coming in. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But I don't want to do some due diligence as well. Most of you do not live in the state of Alabama. It will not affect you, at least directly, whether or not Judge Roy Moore or Doug Jones becomes the next senator from Alabama. It might affect some of the votes we're talking about here. But what is being done right now with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and what is being done right now in Congress on tax reform will affect your family. So I think you'd like to know a little bit about what is happening there as well. We come back, we'll talk a little bit about a few of these ways in which the Senate bill might be better than the House. Then we're going to get into, well, what are the options for voters in Alabama? Is it even possible that Luther Strange could step down and there'd be enough pressure on Alabama Governor Kay Ivey to actually hold another election? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Europe and other countries in the world are facing a demographic winter, but now it seems the United States is headed in the same direction. John Stonestreet talks about this in a recent Breakpoint commentary. A country needs a fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman in order to maintain its population. The population will shrink if that number drops below that number unless compensated by increased levels of immigration. Greece, Italy, Spain, and Germany have a fertility rate of less than 1.4. The United States currently has a fertility rate of less than 1.9. This is a significant drop-off since the post-war baby boom that reached a fertility rate of 3.8 children per woman. America's drop in fertility has been masked by immigration. Immigrants produced children that native-born Americans were not having, and also these immigrants tended to have higher fertility rates. In previous commentaries, I've also talked about the fact that the fertility rate varies from group to group. For example, conservatives have more children than liberals. Christians have more children than secularists. As you might imagine, secular liberals have been writing about this fertility gap because they realize that Christians are giving birth to future Christians and conservatives are giving birth to future conservatives. That doesn't always happen since universities and secular media have been fairly effective at converting Christian kids into atheists and conservative students into progressives. Sometimes it's difficult to see the prospect of a decline in America's population when you look at the crowded nursery at your church. Christians in general have higher fertility rates. We know that children are a gift from the Lord and rejoice with a quiver full of them, Psalm 127. Sadly, we live in a world that does not view children as God's gift, and that is why we are headed for a demographic winter. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to be talking about Judge Roy Moore in just a minute, but one of the other issues I put on the table is, what about this idea of repealing the mandate for Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, the requirement that you have to buy insurance? And as I pointed out, there are some that are caught in the middle that find themselves making too much so that they do not qualify for any of the subsidies, but making too little to really be able to afford the policy. And so then if they decide not to, the actual penalty now is about $1,400 almost in round numbers. So there are some real questions that has. So I'd love to hear your thoughts as well about whether or not you think you should be forced to buy insurance, especially insurance that you do not want. Maybe you'd like to get a catastrophic policy, but not one that actually has such a high deductible and such high payments that you'll never, ever use it, and yet you are required to buy it. And so there are some really important questions on the table there. And again, I just wanted to mention real quickly that there's another very good article. Maybe we'll talk more about that tomorrow in our weekend edition. 6 ways the Senate improves the House tax reform. Adam Mitchell says it this way: if you are a middle-class taxpayer, the bill has lots to like. Tax rates are lowered, the standard deduction is doubled, and the child tax credit is increased. It says to $1,600. Now there's one that says $2,000, and a parent and non-child dependent credit is added. If you're a working taxpayer employed by a business or the owner of your own business, there's even more to like. The corporate tax rate is cut from 35%, one of the highest rates in the world, to 20% immediately. Family-owned and small businesses that pay their taxes as individuals will pay a maximum rate of 25% on certain business income. And so, again, the 6 points, first of all, it lowers tax rates at every level. That's one that we've talked about quite a bit. Number 2, a full repeal of the state and local tax deduction. And so that is something that you find in the Senate proposal, although very different from the House. Number 3, simpler treatment of business income. I talked about that just a minute ago, as well as better treatment of investments, where both House and Senate bills allow 5 years of full expensing for new equipment. And number 5, lower tax rate on overseas profits. Remember, we talked about that the other day in terms of the fact that you have anywhere from $2 trillion to $3 trillion, which are overseas. These are owned by American companies, but they are willing to bring it back in large part because they would have to pay this onerous tax. This would bring that back and almost be like an infusion of cash into the economy instantaneously. And then number 6, of course, repeal of the individual mandate. So those are some issues in terms of the tax form. But let's also give some of you a chance to weigh in on the other issue, and that is Judge Roy Moore. In light of what we know, of course, now we have a 6th accuser accusing Judge Roy Moore of groping her when she was 28. You have that issue. This is Tina Johnson of Gadsden, Alabama, alleging this when she was in his law office with her mother on legal business back in 1991. And so you can again see that is one more, if you will, shoe to drop. Another one for Congress, which we're going to see a lot of these, Senator Al Franken. You can see the picture there that has been posted of an individual that was groped by him. A TV host and sports broadcaster accused him of kissing and groping her without her consent. And we can get into all the details of that in just a few minutes. But the question is, in light of all of these allegations, and wherever you come down, either the uncertainty or just the fact that there are times when it certainly seems like Judge Roy Moore has not been telling the truth about certain things, what do you do? Well, if you have the election and Judge Roy Moore wins, there is a possibility that indeed he might still be removed from office. It would require a censure vote in the Senate. It would require him removal from office, and then it would require the Alabama governor, Kay Ivey, to call another special election. This first one was called by Robert Bentley back in January. And so then you've got some other issues involved as well. You've got then if Doug Jones is elected, well, then that's it. He becomes the senator. Or the third option that has been floated around the Capitol Hill and also around Washington, and that is what would happen if the current senator, Luther Strange, steps down from the seat. Could that trigger a new special election? So far, the Alabama governor, Kay Ivey, has said no. Her argument was the election date is set for December 12th. Were he to resign, I would simply appoint someone to fill the remaining time until we have election on December 12th. Now, that could change with public pressure. There could be people that said, wait a minute, this is not fair. I voted early voting. By the way, is that another good argument against early voting? I voted early, but now I've learned all this. I'd like to retract my vote. Or we didn't really have a thorough vetting of this. If we'd known this in the primary, many of us would have actually voted for Luther Strange, and we would prefer him over Doug Jones. There's all sort of what-ifs that could have brought about. But nevertheless, that's the circumstance we find ourselves in right now. The possibility that Roy Moore would be elected, there is at least one poll that says he's up by 6 points. The other is that Doug Jones is elected, and there's another poll that shows him ahead by 12 points. I don't trust any of these polls. You know how that goes. And then, of course, the other possibility of Luther Strange actually stepping down and somehow convincing the governor to actually hold an election that probably would take place in January or February to replace Jeff Sessions. So we got a lot of things to put on the table, and we have some phone calls. So let's go to Louisiana first, KPAE. And Ricky, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, Kerby. It's against all behavioral science and psychology. If Judge Roy Moore was molesting women 40 years ago, he'd been molesting women 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years. I mean, you don't just, stop. Okay, I'm not going to do it no more. No, it's against all behavioral, common sense, behavioral science, psychology. The amazing thing is that the Democratic Party and George Soros didn't pay more women to produce fake allegations and lies against Judge Roy Moore. I guess if they got 100 women, that, you know, all their testimonies like Jesus, you know, they'd be conflicting and they'd all fall apart. So they said, well, let's just pay about a half a dozen women to make it kind of halfway believable that George Roy somehow is a pervert or something. No, the man's did more to advance Christianity, the Constitution, the Bible, and the United States in the last 20 years than all Christian politicians combined. That says a lot. That man gave up the job twice because of his conscience toward God, the Bible. I mean, just fabrication of law. It's going to come to light. Be sure you send. We'll find you out. Once he gets elected, all these women's testimony is going to come to. Why is it 40 years ago? Well, because they don't have no witnesses to corroborate their false lies about Judge Moore. That's why they go back 40 years ago. Like one manager tomorrow, oh, the poor guy died, so we can't confirm that story. Now, can we? I mean, you got to remember, the basic plank of the Democratic Party is to kill babies, and the second plank is sodomy. I mean, these people got seared consciences. They thrive on lies. Well, how come the Republican women have come forth? Even though one said, "Oh, I voted for Trump." Well, prove it. Prove. You know, you got a dozen family friends or co-workers that know that you're a Republican. No, she don't have that. Why? Because she's lying. They're all lying. I mean, you know,
it's hard for me to say that all half a dozen of them are lying and that all of them were paid, but okay, you know, want to give everybody a chance to express their opinion, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. 1-800-351-1212. Sixth accuser has stepped forward, and I suspect maybe more to drop, and of course her argument is that Roy Moore groped her, but let's bring one more to the table, and that is, if you haven't seen this, they even have photo of evidence here. Although the photo isn't that damning, it's not great either. But nevertheless, Meredith McGraw, KABC anchor, and said that Senator Al Franken kissed and groped me without my consent. There's nothing funny about that. And so, again, you have the, I don't recall kind of response that comes from, in this case, Senator Al Franken. And as I've pointed out, this doesn't come at a time when some of the Democrats wanted to sort of clear the air. As we mentioned this week, there have been a number of stories coming out, including some that are saying, you know, maybe we went too light on Ted Kennedy. Maybe we went too light on Bill Clinton. Maybe in light of what we've learned from Harvey Weinstein, and now maybe some of these other cases, we probably should have done a little bit thorough justice and maybe taken some of the statements by these women more seriously. We shouldn't have allowed their reputations to have been sullied the way they were. And so I think that was an attempt in many cases by the Democrats to kind of clear the decks a little bit so they could come back and then focus attention on people like Roy Moore or, of course, Donald Trump and whoever else they might have in mind. But Al Franken kind of upset the party a little bit. So I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. What's your comment? We'll take those phone calls right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Talked about everything from the Senate and House tax reform bill, Obamacare, and of course now focusing on Judge Roy Moore and the latest allegations of Al Franken. The first article we have here is the Obamacare mandate repeal. Second one are some of the improvements in the Senate tax bill that might affect you. Later, we have an article here as well we posted on a woman accusing Al Franken. And as I mentioned in the second hour, we're going to be talking with John Eidsmoe about his book, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. But, of course, he's also dealt with the Alabama Supreme Court. He knows Judge Roy Moore pretty well, so I'd love to get his comments on that as well. But let's get your comments. First of all, go to the state of Georgia on the Good News Network. Kenny, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes.
You are on the air. What would you like to ask or add?
Yes, I'm a middle class, I guess working class, and my insurance costs me $2,150 a month. And I'm just wondering how's this revision going to benefit me?
Yeah, okay, good question. And a couple of different ways. And let me broaden it because, you know, some people are in your situation, others are in different situations. But first of all, in terms of paying taxes, it has actually doubled the standard deduction. So that means if you're an individual, the deduction would be $12,000. If you're married, it would be $24,000. So that means some people that are even close to the median family income won't even pay any income taxes. Then for people that have families, the child tax credit, one bill says $1,600, another says $2,000. So this would be a very definite kind of pro-family kind of benefit. But back to your insurance issue, that's one of the 6 points that I've posted on this article that comes from the Daily Signal, the repeal of the individual mandate. What that means is you say, well, wait a minute, I don't want to pay that. We have some people that say, I don't want to get insurance at all. Or I want to get some insurance that maybe just covers me if I get cancer, I'm a major car accident, but I just recognize that I am not going to be able to pay for insurance that I know that I will never use. And so that's kind of the issue that we find ourselves in so often. I've talked about what sometimes I call the working poor. You look at individuals that are above the poverty line, but nevertheless are forced, as it says here in this very good article in the Wall Street Journal, are forced to buy a product they cannot afford. They're not eligible for tax credits or cost-sharing payments to mitigate the damage. And if they don't buy insurance, the mandate fine will be as large as $1,390. So this might give a fairly significant relief to people in the middle class, one, in terms of taxes, and two, to remove the burden of the mandate. Now, once that mandate is removed, I think there are some options. First of all, as I've mentioned before, a lot of Christians are starting to say, maybe we don't want to do insurance, we'd like to do health sharing. And we've talked about before, things like MediShare and the Samaritan's Ministry and others, where you actually bind together with like-minded Christians and have something that is similar to insurance, but it's not insurance, and you're working with people that have the same kind of attitudes, values, and lifestyle that you have. So those are at least a couple of quick answers. I think we'll spend a little more time tomorrow in our roundtable trying to get into, again, what will the Senate tax reform bill do for the middle class? What will the House tax reform bill do? Penna Dexter will be with me, and we'll get into some of that and maybe answer the questions in even more detail. But let's go back to the phones. I think some of you want to talk about Judge Roy Moore and some of these allegations. Of course, the new allegations against Senator Al Franken. So we'll stay in Georgia for another minute or two on the Good News Network. Sharon, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I just feel as a victim myself of a vicious rape and beating that these women should have come forward sooner. It's actually a symptom, began as a symptom, and now we have an epidemic state. And I think sometimes these are women that I feel could possibly have allowed these situations because they had ulterior motives. They wanted to either move higher up in the ladder in D.C. or they wanted to get favors in Hollywood, and they were willing to do whatever. But now that it's an open forum, it's like, oh, yeah, he did this and he did that. I don't excuse the situation at all. Again, having been a victim, I do feel that we as a nation have fallen short, as a Christian nation particularly, in protecting the women and the young ladies of our country. But I also feel that we need to be like with Clinton and with the Kennedys and that. We need to hold the people we put in office in more social moral accountability, and it's not happening.
Well,
and
again, now it's finally happening. I mean, you got this film coming out next year called Chappaquiddick, and you have one of the people reviewing it saying, Ted Kennedy should, by all rights, have stood trial for involuntary manslaughter. You have one of the individuals writing for the New York Times saying, of the Clinton accusers, the one who haunts me is Juanita Broaddrick. She tells a story that sounds very much like Harvey Weinstein saying, I can't meet you at the hotel coffee shop, so come up to my room, and he raped her. And she says, I believe her. Well, where were those reporters back then when they wanted to protect the Kennedy family, wanted to protect the Clinton family? And so I see a fair amount of blame there. You're pointing some blame as well on some of these women because, as one woman said, I was just going to take what happened with Judge Roy Moore to my grave. Well, you know what happens. If indeed you're talking about a predator, they're going to do it again. And so when we don't actually report, whether it's reporting in a church, by the way, I think the next shoe to drop are going to be some pastors we're going to hear about as well, that they didn't report this, they didn't take action here, and those kinds of things. But whether it happens in a church, whether it happens in a denomination, whether it happens in Hollywood, or whether it happens in government, when you don't report, you're going to, I sense, probably in most cases, encourage more of that kind of behavior in the future.
Well, I agree. I think that the churches are also going to come under scrutiny, just like the Catholic Church did with the priests. I don't think it's humanity, and whatever office they hold does not excuse their deviant behavior. It just masks it. And I think that as women, we need to be, particularly Christian women, more forthright. We need to be stronger. We need to be girded up and not allow the enemy to come against us with such vicious things as a rape and use that as a noose to keep hanging us, the victims. But I also feel that the counterbalance of that is also, if you are willing to play the game of fire, it will come back to you eventually. And these women are now coming forward, and I'm not certain what their reasons are. If their reasons are to clean and clear the air, fine. But if their reasons are to try and shame a man that's down, I don't agree with that either. If he did it, he should be held accountable.
But again, since we have 6,
50 years later.
We got so many different motivations now because we have 6 accusers. And so you have some that were initially contacted by the Washington Post who said, we didn't really want to talk about this. And then others that have come forward since then. So you got all sorts of different motives there. So it's kind of hard to come up with one.
Yes, and like Chappaquiddick, I was old enough in Chappaquiddick. I was in my 20s. I totally remember the headlines of that. I totally remember, and I do remember the DA trying to push it through. And again, the money trail superseded the judicial aspects. If you had enough money, you basically got away with everything. I mean, the Clintons, they are, to me, paramount of what lawyers do illegally and get away with it. And he did it in the office as a president, in a presidential office, as far as his inability to be able to be a gentleman. He disgraced the office and everything. But the victim of the time was willing to be a participant, and then all of a sudden she becomes a victim. So that diminishes the act, and that's what's happening now. These women are coming away, and I know what it's like. I know what it's like not to want to talk about it. I know what it's like to have that. You have social aspects back in the day when I was beaten and raped. It was always the woman's fault. It was always you wore something too loose, too tight, whatever.
Yeah, I know.
But now we have this open forum of where rape is put out there as a venue of discussion where it never was a venue of discussion. So I totally agree if these women, some of them are coming forward because they're trying to cleanse their soul of a very horrific act that takes your soul. But I also feel that we need to make sure the weight of judgment is judicial, in that you're also going to have people jump on board with, oh, yeah, it happened to me too, and not tell you the whole story. I was willing because I wanted to have a favor. I was willing but I really didn't want to. But you were willing to take Satan's offer. If you do this, I can do this. And that's what it amounts to. Now, those who viciously were attacked or unwillingly taken advantage of, those are women that do need to be, in some way, that horrible situation to be resolved.
I appreciate your comment.
I'm not sure all of this is the way.
Well, we're going to take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was September 1956, and Elihu Schimmel was cold and lonely. He was stationed aboard a U.S. naval vessel above the Arctic Circle. His location would account for his being cold, but he didn't think there was much to be done about his loneliness. Rosh Hashanah was set to begin, and aside from another Jewish sailor, Schimmel was several friends short of a minyan, a quorum of 10 Jewish men necessary for services. But Schimmel knew there were others scattered about the fleet in the coldest theater of the Cold War. He decided to ask the powers that be if they would help. The Navy and the Army, hitching a ride, enthusiastically agreed. The order went out that those wishing to join Schimmel aboard ship would be transported by seaplane, launch, or helicopter for the observance of the Jewish high holy days. When the time came, 10 Jewish servicemen showed up, exactly enough. The Navy went further, announcing at sunset that the services were about to begin and ordering all aboard to show reverence by putting out their cigarettes. Schimmel served out his time as a naval medical officer, but he would never forget that celebration high above the Arctic Circle, made possible courtesy of the United States military. And we now won't forget how the United States military honored the religious liberty of its service members. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. John Eidsmoe will be with us in the second hour. We'll be talking about his book, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. But I first, of course, want to ask him some questions, since he's known Judge Roy Moore probably longer than most of us, worked with him at the Alabama Supreme Court. He was scheduled to talk about his book, so I'm going to certainly talk about Judge Roy Moore with him as well. And if you would like to join that conversation, you are free to do so as well in the second hour. 1-800-351-1212. We talked with Sharon just a minute ago, and she certainly believes that women need to come forward, but why they do. We have to, at least, as we always have here, acknowledge that some of these allegations of rape are false. The Duke Lacrosse case is a good example. The one in Virginia at the fraternity, Phi Kappa Psi, a couple of examples which are not true and were actually debunked. But in many cases, we, I think, should trust those individuals that step forward. And in this new environment, created in part maybe first by Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, now the whole list of Hollywood actors and producers, now I believe we're going to hear a lot more from members of Congress. Of course, the third article we've posted here today is about the woman who is accusing Al Franken, who is a senator from Minnesota, of kissing and groping her without her consent. So we have lots of issues on the table, and if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to South Carolina this time. Mike, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, I agree with about 75% of what your previous caller said. And if Judge Moore has done what he has been accused of, I think that they should be investigated on an individual basis before his election, if there's time. I know it's a time-consuming thing, but the one I don't recall her name. I believe she may have been the first accuser. She was 14 years old and said they had relations. I don't think it was physical. She gave him her phone number. Now, if he's going to call, and he's in his 30s, if he's going to call her home, and I need to speak to such and such, I can't recall her name. Have to go through her mother. To speak to this girl, isn't there some kind of something inappropriate there, a gray area that somebody would throw a flag up, even if it was in the late 60s or 70s, and say, "Why are you calling my daughter?" And I just see it that these things do need to be held accountable for, and that a lot of things aren't. Like that you hear the other commentators on the radio, Limbaugh and some others, trying to hang the Russian thing on Hillary. What if she did? She probably did, and the money she makes, she probably did. What are they going to do? What are they really going to do? Are they going to arrest Hillary Clinton?
No.
Really?
Never happening. They may investigate it, and after hearing Jeff Sessions, who, by the way, is the one whose seat we're trying to fill here, I got the sense that maybe there's going to be some investigation, but we'll see. But the person you're thinking about is Lee Korfman, and she was one that was interviewed by the Washington Post, and that's kind of where that started. But it's a good question because, you know, when Judge Roy Moore was on with Sean Hannity, there's where I think a lot of people said, okay, that was the last straw. They saw him on Friday and said, you know, he's obviously not forthcoming, or probably a better word, seems to be lying about some of this. He was saying, no, generally I didn't date these women. Yeah, well, yes, you did. We got all sorts of prosecutors who had worked with Judge Roy Moore in the early 80s saying it was common knowledge that Roy Moore dated high school girls. We have the story about the fact that he would go to the mall, that he was banned from a mall. We have the response from the mother. So you have some of that. But your point's well taken. I mean, again, why can't we postpone this December 12th election? I don't see that the Alabama governor wants to do that. As a matter of fact, when they were floating the idea yesterday of having Luther Strange step down to trigger a new special election, the governor wouldn't have any of it. And so I don't know how much investigation you can do between now and December 12th. And back to the key point that I've made earlier and mentioned more than once. This is why early voting is not a good idea, because those people who've already voted for Roy Moore may want their vote back in light of what they know. And so there's just, and of course, the people that voted for Roy Moore in the primary over Luther Strange might want their vote back. And so you can't always postpone an election, but this is pretty significant. And I think there is good reason to believe that Doug Jones is going to be the Democratic senator from Alabama. But we'll see how that plays out. And let's go back to the phones and give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. In Texas, KBJS, Patricia, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Okay, I haven't got to hear enough. I'm just curious about the yearbook. That what did the message say in the yearbook? And the other thing was, did she evidently ask him to sign it? Because I don't know anybody that gets their yearbook signed unless you ask them to.
Yeah, and there are some people that are alleging, and I think you could make a case that it's possible that there was a person by the name of Roy that signed it, but then later the name Moore was added to it, so that maybe it's a forgery or whatever.
Yeah,
there's all there's all those possibilities. I think the bigger issue is not what was in the yearbook, but what actions took place, and more importantly, this has been raised a few times, and one of our earlier callers brought it up as well. Don't you see a pattern? I mean, even this most recent accuser, which is the sixth accuser, Tina Johnson of Gadsden, Alabama, said this happened back in 1991. If indeed you're alleging that Roy Moore is a predator, then wouldn't you have some other examples in a little bit more recent? That is the most recent one. I will give credit for that, which it is much closer to that time period than some of those that happened supposedly during the late 70s and 80s. But, again, that's why this one, I think, causes a lot of people to go, okay, that's enough. We've got to go somewhere else. And this is why, of course, you've had some people suggesting that maybe by Luther Strange stepping down, that might actually trigger a special election. But as much as that's a possibility, at the moment, it's just a theoretical possibility. So let me just mention that we're going to be, when we come back from the break, talking with John Eidsmoe. His book is entitled Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. The most recent volume is on the Reformation and colonial benefits and various sources. And so he looks at ancient wisdom. He looks at, of course, the Christian and Roman law, as well as the Reformation and colonial period. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where we get our foundations for law. But I would be remiss if I didn't start off by asking him about Judge Roy Moore. He has worked with him for many years, has known him for decades, and I'd love to get some of his thoughts as he joins the program today. But also we want to encourage you to get copies of his book, which will really help you understand what are the foundations of law. And if we're going to educate ourselves about the law, if we're going to try to get a new generation to really begin to develop what I would call jurisprudence, how you apply moral principles to the law, we need these kinds of books. So we'll be talking about that as well. Let me just mention that in this first hour here, we have talked about the Senate tax bill and how that could be a real improvement for individuals in the middle class. We've talked about how one of the elements of that is to actually repeal the Obamacare mandate. That's significant, and may be significant for those of you that have said, I don't want to pay for insurance I will never use. And then one of the other articles we've posted here is the story about the woman who's accusing Senator Al Franken about kissing and groping her without her consent. Seems like all we talk about these days are lots of really tawdry kinds of stories, but those are in the news, and we need to think about those from a moral and political and Christian perspective as well. So that's why we're going to do what we're going to do. John Eidsmoe will join us. We'll talk about law, but first, I want to ask him some questions about Judge Roy Moore. All that coming up right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you are homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program any length of time, you know how we've lamented that in some respects when we talk about the law, individuals are convinced that ethics are whatever you want them to be. The law is whatever a majority of people might think. And so we need to come back to some of the historic and theological foundations of law. And that's why I'm excited about this book series that has come out by John Eidsmoe. The previous books dealt with the ancient legal systems and then the Hebrew legal system, then classical legal systems, common law. This one looks more at some of the Reformation and the colonial influence as well. And so John Eidsmoe is the author of that book. And as an individual, really brings a lot to the discussion because he has served in the military as a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel. He's also professor of Oak Brook College of Law and Government, also an adjunct professor for a law school in South Korea. He is well known for some of his books like Christianity and the Constitution, a book I quote quite frequently, God and Caesar, Columbus and Cortez, this series as well. But he has also served, and this will relate to some of the conversation we've had in the first hour, he served as a senior staff attorney with the Alabama Supreme Court, and for that reason probably knows Judge Roy Moore quite well. So, John Eidsmoe, welcome back to Point of View.
Always good to be here, Kerby. Good to be on your program again.
Before we talk about the book, let's, if we can, talk about Judge Roy Moore. You perhaps know him better than any of the people that have called in today or over the last couple of days. We have all these allegations and things of that nature. You served in the Supreme Court. You know him. Can you give us any insight that maybe we need to hear?
Well, I'm senior counsel for the Foundation for Moral Law, and that's the foundation Justice Moore established. And the foundation is a 501c3, and so we have kept the foundation and the campaign distinct. And that being the case, I've stayed away from it. I don't really have too much to say, except I'll simply say this, and speaking in my own personal capacity, not the foundation's, and that's that I have known Judge Moore for approximately 22 years. And we have been involved in many court cases together. I have represented him in several of his Ten Commandments battles. We have prayed together. We have studied the Bible together. We have litigated. We have fought, argued sometimes, not always agreed. But in all of this time, I have to say that he has never lied to me, and he has never done anything in my presence or said anything in my presence that would indicate sexual impropriety. All that being the case, when he says that he did not commit these acts, I believe him.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to hear from you because you probably know him better than a lot of us. And as we open up the phones again, if you want to ask questions of John Eidsmoe about Roy Moore or something like that, feel free to do so. But I wanted to get into this because what we have right now is a belief in law that we talked about just the other day, this idea of sociological law, that the law is not based upon any kind of moral foundations. You've written a series of books. These are 3 very thick books. We're talking about 1,400 pages covering all the major ancient religions, even legal systems. And the foundation of the book, if I can summarize it, is that law should rest upon morality. And we used to teach in law schools jurisprudence, where you would study these legal systems, the Roman and Christian principles, the Reformation and the rest. But except in the places maybe where you teach, that's not taught very much anymore, is it?
No, and even though it is taught at many law schools, it's taught as kind of like ancient history, and that doesn't really apply anymore, but it's quaint to see what they did back in those days. But that's been the basic premise behind this entire book, to demonstrate that the most basic issue facing law, not only in America, but throughout the world, is whether law is simply what the state says it is, in which case there's no basis for resistance, and there's no such thing as an unjust law because the state is the highest arbiter of truth, or whether law reflects a higher reality than that which government can express, that law to be valid has to reflect what Jefferson in the Declaration called the laws of nature and of nature is God, what Blackstone called the revealed law found in Scripture and the law of nature that is also of God but is revealed to us through the God-given faculty of human reason. And the point I try to make, particularly in Volume 1 of this series, is going through all of these ancient societies from Egypt to China to Hawaii to the ancient Incas, Mayas, and Aztecs, all the way up to the Iroquois Confederacy. The point I've tried to make in all of these is that every one of them believes that its laws came to them from a higher source than man, God or the gods or the Tao or whatever they want to call it. But the idea that law is man-made is a modern aberration. And secondly, that law does not begin with the primitive and evolve into the sophisticated and complex. Rather, these legal systems in their earliest forms were sophisticated, were enlightened, and in many cases they degenerate as time goes on.
Well, and again, one of the things that I even remember in some previous interviews, Judge Roy Moore, and you as well, find yourself is when you even express the idea that law is based upon God, not based upon the state. There are people saying, can you believe these people believe, or actually say these kinds of things? Because what was considered to be the foundation of our republic, whether you look at an individual that would hardly be able to sign the doctrinal statement of our churches, Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, or whether you look at James Madison and all sorts of other individuals, Benjamin Rush and the rest, they all believed that the law rested upon a moral foundation that was revealed to us. Now, some might just see it was revealed in natural law. Some believe it was revealed in the Scripture. But all of them believe that our rights come from God. But if you have, John Eidsmoe, a philosophy that our rights come from the government, well, the government can give you rights and the government can take them away, can't he?
Exactly. And that's the whole premise of the Declaration of Independence, that we have the self-evident truth that all men are not evolved equal, but created equal, and that they are endowed not by their government with certain negotiable privileges, but by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And if government is the source of rights, then government can take them away, in which case they're not really rights, they're privileges, and they're not unalienable, they are negotiable. That which the state gives, the state can take away.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into a little bit more, and then I know some people want to talk about Judge Roy Moore, and they are welcome to do so, but I wanted to mention, as we come back, the whole influence of Martin Luther. Last month, I might mention, John, we spent a fair amount of time talking about Martin Luther. We had people in studio like Eric Metaxas. We had other people by phone like Erwin Lutzer. We had Reg Grant in studio. We had Max McLean and others. And the reason we did that is because we just had the 500th anniversary of the posting of the 95 Theses in the Wittenberg Door, and really, in a sense, the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And so I'd love to have you maybe speak to that issue, because some people might say, well, I understand how the law is based upon the Hebraic legal system, or maybe how it was based upon the Roman Republic. But what contribution did Lutherans, what contribution did some of the Calvinists and others have in terms of our understanding of law? So that's one of the things that is in this latest volume, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law, the Reformation and Colonial America. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Europe and other countries in the world are facing a demographic winter. But now it seems the United States is headed in the same direction. John Stonestreet talks about this in a recent Breakpoint commentary. A country needs a fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman in order to maintain its population. The population will shrink if that number drops below that number unless compensated by increased levels of immigration. Greece, Italy, Spain, and Germany have a fertility rate of less than 1.4. The United States currently has a fertility rate of less than 1.9. This is a significant drop-off since the post-war baby boom that reached a fertility rate of 3.8 children per woman. America's drop in fertility has been masked by immigration. Immigrants produced children that native-born Americans were not having, and also these immigrants tended to have higher fertility rates. In previous commentaries, I've also talked about the fact that the fertility rate varies from group to group. For example, conservatives have more children than liberals. Christians have more children than secularists. As you might imagine, secular liberals have been writing about this fertility gap because they realize that Christians are giving birth to future Christians and conservatives are giving birth to future conservatives. That doesn't always happen since universities and secular media have been fairly effective at converting Christian kids into atheists and conservative students into progressives. Sometimes it's difficult to see the prospect of a decline in America's population when you look at the crowded nursery at your church. Christians in general have higher fertility rates. We know that children are a gift from the Lord and rejoice with a quiver full of them, Psalm 127. Sadly, we live in a world that does not view children as God's gift, and that is why we are headed for a demographic winter. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have John Eidsmoe with us today, author of the book, actually book series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. Earlier books have dealt with the ancient legal systems, the Hebrew legal system, classical legal system, common law, and the rest. This particular one deals with the Reformation and colonial America. I might just mention we have information about that on our website. We also have some of the latest allegations. Of course, the sixth accuser accusing Roy Moore of groping her. Of course, Senator Al Franken also accused of groping this particular woman, who is a TV host and sports broadcaster, without her consent. The latest one in Hollywood to drop is Sylvester Stallone today. So every time we turn around, we have another one. And we're talking about this, and a little bit later we'll take some of your phone calls because, again, I know Judge Roy Moore is on your mind. And, of course, since we have an individual who served as the senior staff attorney with the Alabama Supreme Court, thought we could get his perspective as well. But what about, for a few more minutes on the book, what about the influence of Martin Luther and John Calvin? You have whole sections on the Lutheran Reformation, the Calvin Reformation. It seems to me that especially Calvin has such an influence in America because of people like John Witherspoon. But connect the dots, if you can, between the theologians and then some of the political philosophers that have given us this country that we enjoy today.
Well, I'd love to do that. In fact, I just returned a couple of weeks ago from Wittenberg in Germany, and I can tell you that the 95 Theses are still there in the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church.
Yes.
Still there, but they're in bronze now, but they are still in Latin. But anyway, one of the main contributions that Luther made to the understanding of law was that when we deal with this relationship of church and state, It isn't what was the medieval Catholic view that, well, there are two kingdoms, the church is the superior kingdom and the state is the inferior, or the view of Erastus, not Erasmus, but Erastus, that the church is subordinate to the state, or the Anabaptist view that they are entirely antithetical to one another. Rather, the view of Luther was that there are two kingdoms, the kingdom of the right, the church, the kingdom of the left, the state. God has established both of them. Neither is superior to the other, and neither is sufficient in the world without the other. That the role of the church, preach the gospel, to proclaim biblical truth. The role of the state is to preserve law and order, to defend our borders and defend our streets. And these views are compatible. They're not to be antithetical to one another. If the church is doing its job right, preaching the gospel and training people in biblical principles, it'll produce good citizens and make it much easier for the state to govern. If the state is doing its job right of preserving law and order, that gives us much more freedom to preach the gospel. And so they complement each other if they're done properly. That would be Luther's view. Calvin's view would be very similar to it.
When Calvin actually spends a fair amount of time talking about government, one of the things I've noticed, John, is that if you go to a seminary, you can actually go through a whole seminary education and never even really talk about government, maybe in passing if somebody requires you to maybe talk about how Christians can relate to the government. But if you go through Calvin's Institutes, there's whole sections in there that relate to what today we would call Christian worldview issues, politics, economics, society, those kinds of things. Have we maybe have sort of a truncated view of theology where today we teach about...
Luther very much the same.
Go ahead.
Luther, in fact, if you look to Luther's 84-volume Luther's works, that he devotes more space there to civil government than any other subject except justification by faith. And like Calvin, Luther had studied law. He studied law and didn't quite finish his legal studies. As he says, he was returning home in a terrible thunderstorm and was afraid for his life, and he made a vow to St. Anne that he would become a monk if he was enabled to return home safely. Now, there are some of us who think he may have made up that story just because he didn't want to take the bar exam, but no, not seriously. But, yes, both Luther and Calvin had studied law themselves. In fact, here's an interesting thing about it, too, that at that time in Germany, you had the Holy Roman Empire trying to impose Roman law upon the northern electorates, the northern states like Saxony, and you have the northern princes resisting this. They wanted to hold to the old Anglo-Saxon common law, which was decentralized and based upon individual rights, and the idea that law does not come from the states, law comes from a higher source, and law does not change. And one of the things the northern princes liked about Luther, not the only thing, not the main thing, but one of the things they liked about Luther was that Luther held to the old view of the Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic common law, and that Luther, like them, was willing to resist the Holy Roman Empire as it sought to impose Roman law.
Wow. Make the connection, if you can, now maybe to America, because you have a chapter, for example, on John Locke. You have chapters on the colonies. How did some of those theological ideas, and how did they go to John Locke and then eventually to Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration, and eventually to James Madison, the architect of the Constitution? How do those connect together?
Well, let's just take a quick transition here and notice how the Anglo-Saxon law of northern Germany was brought by the Angles and Saxons to Britain, who then changed the name of Britain to Angleland or England, and that it became the Anglo-Saxon common law of England. And, of course, the colonists then bring that same Anglo-Saxon common law and bring it to America. But John Locke, in particular, is the son of a Puritan lawyer. John Locke may not have been 100% orthodox on everything, particularly on the subject of the depravity of human nature. He believed very much in the power of human reason, but he was a strong believer in the truth of the Scriptures. In fact, he repeatedly emphasizes the inerrancy of the Word and says, "You can show me anything that I have said in my writings that is contrary to the inerrant Word of God, I will immediately retract it and correct it." But John Locke, in his first treatise on civil government, quotes from the scriptures 20-some times, and his second treatise quite a few more times than that.
Yes.
And his whole emphasis is that the Bible is the source of his understanding. Now, a couple of the points that we associate especially with John Locke are, number one, the idea that government is by social compact, that is, that people get together and compact to give government certain power. And if you read through his writings, he bases that squarely on the doctrine of the Noachic covenant, God-given natural right. And he bases this doctrine on the rights that God gives to Adam and Eve in the garden, and particularly on parental rights, which is the basis for all governmental authority, he says. Now, if John Locke didn't believe the Bible, then why does he use the Bible as his basic source of authority for two of his most fundamental concepts?
Yes. Well, again, those end up again to America because of the teachings of John Witherspoon and others. And so, as a result, we are the inheritors of some of those ideas that flow from Luther and Calvin to Locke to eventually everybody from Thomas Jefferson all the way to James Madison, correct?
Maybe we should mention John Witherspoon. And I don't deal with Witherspoon very much in this series, but I do have a chapter on him in Christianity and the Constitution that you mentioned earlier. By the way, I might just mention that this series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law, is available not only through Nordskog, the publisher, but also through Wall Builders. David Barton of Wall Builders. They're selling it, and if you go to the Wall Builders website, you can find it there. But John Locke was one of the sources that the Founding Fathers quoted more often than just about any other. Blackstone first, or Blackstone second, Montesquieu first. Well, the Bible most of all, but next to those, John Locke. But you look at John Witherspoon. There's a chapter on Witherspoon in Christianity and the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Witherspoon was a Calvinist Presbyterian pastor from Scotland, leader of the evangelical party of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, who came to America to become the president of a little school called the College of New Jersey, and some of our listeners may recently changed its name to something like Princeton. But there he taught many of the Founding Fathers. In fact, at least 9 of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention had been Princeton graduates, and we see many of those graduates going on to become congressmen, senators, governors, and one, the President of the United States, James Madison. In fact, Madison stayed at Princeton a semester after graduation so he could study Hebrew and could read the Hebrew laws and institutions in the original language.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. I know many of you have some comments or questions, and if you want to address some of the topics we've addressed here today, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Judge Roy Moore, the interpretation of law, a lot of it is fair game. We'll be back right after this.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. John Eidsmoe with us as we talk about his book series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. Of course, many of you have comments about the situation with Judge Roy Moore, and if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to South Carolina, WAGP. Bruce, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, thank you for taking my call. What I wanted to say was I don't believe this man is guilty at all. I think this is a ploy by the liberals or maybe even the establishment Republicans because they don't like him. They don't want him in there. They don't want fresh blood. Kind of smacks of Judge Clarence, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, if you remember that.
Yes, high-tech lynching, he called it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so and the thing is, if Roy Moore steps down, then he's going to encourage this. This kind of thing is going to continue to happen. It's just like the United States does not pay ransoms to terrorists, because if you do that, you just encourage them to continue because it works. So I don't think the man should step down, and I think the people of the state of Alabama need to support him fully, and we need somebody like him in the Senate.
Bruce, I appreciate your comments. You know, one of the things, John, that we struggle with on this is that you do have some cases. I mentioned them in the last hour, the Duke lacrosse case, the rape case, the Phi Kappa Psi Virginia case, and a few where there were allegations that turned out to be false. And I, at this point, have some questions when you have 6 accusers stepping forward. But back to the Bruce's comment for just a minute, it does seem to me that if indeed this tactic works, we're going to see more of it, because in this hyper-partisan environment right now, it seems like you can take down just about anybody with certain kinds of allegations. Any thoughts about that?
Well, again, I'm trying to distance the foundation from the campaign.
Sure.
So I don't really comment except to say that he's absolutely correct, that you could make those allegations about anybody. And there was a great British jurist by the name of Matthew Hale back in the mid-1800s. And Matthew Hale once said about the charge of rape, he said that rape is a charge that is easy to make, difficult to prove, and extremely difficult to defend against, no matter how innocent you may be. And the point is, it can be made against anybody, and yes, we don't want to encourage that, now that we want to discourage genuine complaints.
We're talking about law. There have been a number of people that have called in and said, well, these are allegations, and, you're innocent till proven guilty. And that is true in a court of law. But at the same time, people have to make decisions when they don't have all of the facts. In the first hour, we talked about everything from Ted Kennedy to Bill Clinton to Harvey Weinstein to whoever it might be. None of those, well, a few of them ended up in court, but most of them did not. But we still could form our decisions about that. But this is going to be difficult, because if you don't have a court of law and you don't have the opportunity to present counterbalanced arguments, our whole legal system is based upon the idea that you can face your accusers before a jury of your peers. But we are kind of moving into a time where the allegations are enough and they will stick with you, as you point out, even though you may be innocent of all of those charges. And we have a few examples of that in history, even recent history, don't we?
We certainly do. And the point of the matter is, of course, that, yes, the basic premise here is that one is innocent until proven guilty. And as a couple have pointed out, that applies in a court of law, criminal law in particular, not necessarily in the political realm. And I would agree that it may be that in the political realm we can't use the concept of proof beyond a reasonable doubt or the standard rules of evidence that a court would reach, but at least we shouldn't be rushing to judgment. And for somebody who has served his country in the military, who has attended West Point, who has served in government in so many capacities, and whose life for the last years that we've known him, 30, 40 years, has been exemplary, that person, I think, should be given at least the presumption of innocence.
Let's see if we can get one more call that I thought, at least maybe you can answer, because I'm not sure I can. Ken in Texas, KBJS, you have a question, and I think maybe John Eidsmoe can help us with that one.
Yeah, John, I was hoping if you could tell me a little bit about his spiritual testimony. Have you heard anything about when he became a believer in Jesus Christ? Because there's a possibility that maybe from his military background, maybe from growing up when I got saved 40 years ago in the 70s, there's a charged up, sexual atmosphere that influenced the way he was. I heard that he was a Democrat at that time. So he becomes born again, becomes a Ten Commandment Christian and a Republican. And that would not be strange to hear if that happened. And I was just wondering if that's a possibility.
Well, he was a lifelong Baptist. When he professed to be saved, I don't recall right now. We've talked about that, but that's been probably 20 years ago we discussed that. I don't recall exactly when, but it's true that, yes, he was a Democrat until probably, maybe, I don't know, I'll just guess maybe 25, 30 years ago, but then the overwhelming majority of people in Alabama were Democrats at that time, and at that time, being a Democrat was generally meant being a conservative here in Alabama in those days. So if that represented not so much a change of ideology, it represents more that he, like thousands of Alabamans over the last several decades, have come to realize that the Democratic Party has embraced a radical liberalism that does not represent what they believe, and, well, the Republican Party is not the party of God, it's closer to their beliefs.
Well, that kind of brings us back to your book for just a few minutes, if I might, and then we'll take some more calls. And that is that there was a time in which there was a little bit more overlap. I can remember when you had very conservative Democrats, and we can talk about Scoop Jackson, or we can talk about Sam Nunn. You had some that were kind of liberal Republicans. I can talk about Nelson Rockefeller, whoever you want to pick in there. And there was a sense in which there was, even though we might disagree on a partisan level, there was still sort of this standard assumption and agreement about rights and about the role of government and about the Constitution. But that has changed dramatically. It is difficult for me when I look at the statements being made by various Democratic senators in the United States Senate who are critical of some of the individuals that have come before them, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, or others, to see that any of them really believe the kinds of things that you talk about in your book. On the Republican side, I'll be fair to say there's some Republicans I'm not sure believe that either. But it does seem to me that we've had a remarkable schism that has taken place. And I guess it would be a fair question, in light of all the things you write about in this 1,400 pages, can you help us understand maybe where we went off track? How did we get to the point where now one party and part of another party believe that law is just what you think it is, and they really aren't even trying to look for the moral basis of law anymore?
Well, I think you're correct. There probably is less overlap between the two major parties now than there used to be, and probably a lot of that has to do with the Goldwater-Johnson election of 1964, that even though Goldwater was defeated heavily in the election, he did realign the Republican Party and made the party a much more ideologically conservative party than it used to be. At the same time, I'd have to say that I think Clinton and following Clinton, Obama have, in the last several decades, made the Democrat Party far more of a liberal party than it ever used to be. There was a time when you have a fair number of pro-life Democrats. There are very few now. And in the South, when I came to Alabama 27 years ago, that a Republican being elected in a statewide election was kind of an anomaly. It would happen, but it was a great rarity. And now Republicans are, minus a fluke, almost assured of being elected statewide in Alabama now. And it's not that people have changed their beliefs. It's that what used to be the old conservative Democrats, they have either died off or they have become Republicans.
Let's see if we can take a break. And just as we are going to a break, let me mention that one of the things we have on our website today is a link, first of all, to the Foundation for Moral Law. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things John Eidsmoe was talking about and about the organization that, of course, has been associated with Judge Roy Moore, that particular link is available there. We also have information about the 3-volume series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. You can find that there. You can also, of course, as we mentioned, our good friend David Barton at Wall Builders has that resource as well. And if you are a young person thinking about going to law school, let me encourage you to get these books. Parents, if you have a young person that's thinking about law school, get these books for them. They're never going to get this in most of the law schools where they will study, and yet they need to know that if they're going to develop a Christian view of law. We'll talk more about some of the resources that are available there at the Foundation for Moral Law right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was September 1956, and Elihu Schimmel was cold and lonely. He was stationed aboard a U.S. naval vessel above the Arctic Circle. His location would account for his being cold, but he didn't think there was much to be done about his loneliness. Rosh Hashanah was set to begin, and aside from another Jewish sailor, Schimmel was several friends short of a minyan, a quorum of 10 Jewish men necessary for services. But Schimmel knew there were others scattered about the fleet in the coldest theater of the Cold War. He decided to ask the powers that be if they would help. The Navy and the Army, hitching a ride, enthusiastically agreed. The order went out that those wishing to join Schimmel aboard ship would be transported by seaplane, launch, or helicopter for the observance of the Jewish high holy days. When the time came, 10 Jewish servicemen showed up, exactly enough. The Navy went further, announcing at sunset that the services were about to begin and ordering all aboard to show reverence by putting out their cigarettes. Schimmel served out his time as a naval medical officer, but he would never forget that celebration high above the Arctic Circle made possible courtesy of the United States military. And we now won't forget how the United States military honored the religious liberty of its service members. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Eidsmoe with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about his series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law, but also, John, for just a minute or two, like to focus on what is on your website, Foundation for Moral Law. Defend our inalienable right to acknowledge God. You and Judge Roy Moore and others have really been in the battle to allow the 10 Commandments to be posted in public places, to defend monuments When you type in about, you have your legal cases. It goes down for most of the page. Concerned about the inclusion of Sharia law and Islamic interpretation. There's just a lot of battles that you have been engaged in trying to fight over the years. So talk about the whole breadth of what you've been trying to address, not only in your books, but in some of these legal cases that you've been involved with as well.
Well, we had one just recently that we were pleased with the result of, the Tings V case. This was a Chinese Christian who was arrested and brutalized in China simply for attending a worship service. After being in jail for several days, his mother was able to get him released by paying a fine simply for attending church, a fine that equaled about 60% of his annual salary, and he was threatened that he'd be imprisoned for a lengthy time if he was ever found at church again. So he came to the United States, and the Immigration Naturalization Service, for technical reasons that I won't go into, decided to deny his petition for asylum. In our brief, we showed in great detail the systematic persecution that not only has been going on, but that is increasing in China. And anyway, the Supreme Court, before they could decide whether to take the case, the Immigration Naturalization Service decided to reconsider this, and we'd like to think our brief was part of the reason. Another case that we had just recently, and this did not have a positive result, but we think we made a contribution nevertheless, was in Bloomfield, New Mexico, where a monument to the Ten Commandments had been placed in the lawn of the city hall, and this was challenged in court. And the Circuit Court of Appeals had ruled that it was an establishment of religion. They appealed to the Supreme Court. We filed an amicus brief in which we tried to argue that going way back into the Renaissance period and through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment period and so on, there was a large group of European scholars and then later American scholars who were looking for a model for Republican government and didn't find it in Greece and Rome, but did find it in the laws of the ancient Hebrews. And that for that reason especially, the Ten Commandments certainly have a relevance to law today and have every proper place in our court decisions and also in front of our courthouses. In fact, Luther talks about this, and we cite some of his statements about this in the book here. Luther, when he says that the Ten Commandments are the expression of natural law, we show in Volume 1 that every one of the Ten Commandments actually has its roots in the book of Genesis itself before they were given in Exodus, and go into the meaning of these in great detail, and then show through a computer search of American courts over 1,000 federal and Alabama, or rather state Supreme Court cases in which the Ten Commandments have been cited in courts of record.
Yes.
And demonstrating their influence on American law today. So those are some of the things we've done. Let me add one thing that might be important here. You mentioned how this book could be of great value to students who are considering going to law.
Yes.
There could be a lot of good sermon material, but it's written on a humanist level, you might say, in the sense that we want people to be able to read and be absorbed in the stories in there and so on. And in fact, the site checking on this book was done, a good share of it was done by a homeschooling family that lives near us.
Mm.
And anyway, and mother was telling how the kids would be talking about at the dinner table the things that they were reading in there and the concepts, the stories, and so on. I said humanist. I meant on a human, that is in contrast to a lawyer or
right.
Theological level. It's written
for sure
for the average person.
Let me just also mention one thing on your website as well, and that is the admonition and encouragement by Kayla Moore, suggesting that schools ignore complaints. That's one of the latest news items there, and it seems to me that that's another issue we're dealing with. People for the Separation of Church and State, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and others, they will oftentimes intimidate a teacher, a school district, a principal, an administrator. And Kayla Moore is just saying, you know, what you should do in most of these cases is just ignore them because it's a lot of bluster. But if you even end up in court, and that is pretty rare, you'll eventually win simply because the law is on your side. True?
Yes. In fact, if you read through what the memo actually says, it's based on a lengthy memo that I drafted and that Kayla and I signed together, and that we sent out to all of the state or the county superintendents and city superintendents, as well as school board members and school attorneys here in Alabama, and it'll be relevant to people outside too. Just simply telling them that, look, when you read these letters from the Freedom from Religion Foundation telling you that the Supreme Court in the Santa Fe case said that you can't have prayer at athletic events, that's not what the court said at all. If you read what they said that the way that it came about in that case, where they had a school election run by the school to determine whether to have prayer, and then another election run by the school to determine who would lead it, and specifically for the purpose of prayer, that the school was too much involved in the process, the court said there. They didn't say you can't have prayer at all. And if you just have students have some time before the beginning of the game there when they can have a presentation at that time, and if the students themselves decide that one of the things they're going to do then is pray, there shouldn't be any problem on that. And what we've encouraged school boards to do, we've encouraged school attorneys to do, is if they're concerned about whether a policy that they have might possibly infringe the First Amendment, contact us. We'll be glad to go over with them, and we want to make sure that that school has the freedom to acknowledge God, and that students have the freedom of speech and freedom of religion, that to the full extent the Constitution protects that right. And if we think they've gone overboard a little bit on this, we'll be glad to help them tweak that policy to try to make sure that it is sound and it will stand up in court.
Again, this is the Foundation for Moral Law, or you can just simply go to morallaw.org, and we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. And John Eidsmoe has been with us today as we've been talking about his 1,400-page, 3-volume series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. And John Eidsmoe, thank you for joining us. I look forward to the next opportunity.
I've always enjoyed it, Kerby. Thanks so much for getting the word out to so many people and doing it so well.
Let's take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we'll have our roundtable. I know Penna Dexter will be with us, and we'll have some other conversation as well, so that we'll get into some of these issues. We talked a little bit about tax policy, and that's one of the articles we've posted. We've talked about the possibility that the Obamacare mandate might be repealed, since the tax bill has moved from the House now and is now moving to the Senate, and we just saw that happen today. Then we'll have those issues. But, of course, we'll also talk about Judge Roy Moore and, of course, Senator Al Franken, and that's the third article we've had posted today. So you can find all of that on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to know a little bit more about this book on the historical and theological foundations of law, we have that information there. We have a video we've posted, How the States Can Save America. My Viewpoints commentary today is on the fact we're moving into a demographic winter because we have so many abortions and because so many families are not having children. So we'll talk about that in the future as well. So lots of great material on the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, let me also encourage you to click on that button that says Donate. We are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you every day. And if you appreciate the news, commentary, and information, we certainly would encourage you to click on that button. Help us out, especially as we come to year end. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our Point of View Friday Weekend Edition.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.